On the 1st of October, 2011, a 51-year-old Englishman walked into the headquarters of one of Japan's most respected companies. He had just been promoted to Chief Executive Officer. He had spent 30 years climbing to reach that office. He was the first non-Japanese person ever to lead Olympus Corporation, a company that made cameras famous around the world and built nearly 70% of all the medical endoscopes used in hospitals on Earth. 2 weeks later, he was fired, not because he failed, because he discovered something the company had been hiding for 20 years, a loss so enormous, so deeply buried, that it would take down the entire board, trigger investigations on 3 continents, and lead to allegations of payments to the Japanese mafia. This is the story of the man who climbed for 30 years to find one number, and what happened when he refused to keep it secret. Michael Christopher Woodford was born on the 12th of June, 1960, in Burton-upon-Trent, a small English town better known for brewing beer than producing executives. He didn't go to Oxford. He didn't go to Cambridge. He studied at Millbank College of Commerce, which was about as far from the elite as you could get in Britain at the time. In 1981, at the age of 21, Woodford got a job as a surgical salesman at a small British subsidiary of a Japanese company called Olympus. His job was to walk into hospitals, open his briefcase, and try to convince British surgeons to buy Japanese endoscopes. He was good at it. By the 1990s, Woodford was running Olympus's medical division for the UK. By 2008, he was managing the entire European operation. He spoke no Japanese. He had never lived in Japan. That same year, 2008, Woodford noticed something strange. Olympus was making acquisitions in Europe. That should have been his responsibility. Instead, the deals were being handled directly from Tokyo by a small circle of men he had never met, for prices that didn't quite make sense. In 2008, Olympus paid $2 billion for a British medical equipment company called Gyrus. That was 5 times Gyrus's annual revenue, 27 times its earnings. And then, in the same year, Olympus paid almost $1 billion for 3 tiny Japanese companies you've never heard of: Altus, Humalabo, and News Chef. One of those companies made microwave cookware. Another was researching mushroom extracts. The third recycled medical waste. None of them had any real revenue. None of them had any connection to cameras or endoscopes. And Olympus had just paid almost $1 billion to buy them. Woodford was disturbed enough that he prepared to resign. But before he could, his bosses in Tokyo made him an offer. They explained the acquisitions. They promised everything was fine, and they promoted him to the main board of directors. He shouldn't have, but he did. And he didn't know it yet, but the most important phase of his career was about to begin. And so was the worst. On the 1st of April, 2011, something happened that had never happened in the 92-year history of Olympus Corporation. A British man was named President and Chief Operating Officer. Reuters reported that some inside Olympus believed Woodford was chosen specifically because he would be. And this is a quote from a Japanese source at the time: "Easy to control. A foreign face who didn't speak the language and would smile for the cameras while the real bosses ran the company." The chairman who chose him was a man named Tsuyoshi Kikukawa. And on the day of the promotion, Kikukawa reportedly told Woodford something privately. Something that sounded like a friendly reminder, but functioned like a warning. "I am the one who has the authority to hire and fire, and to decide remuneration for board members and the next tier down of management. In other words, I made you. I can break you." 3 months later, on the 30th of July, 2011, Woodford received an email from his German colleagues. They had translated an article from a small Japanese financial magazine called FACTA, so obscure that almost no major Japanese newspaper had ever picked up its stories. The article alleged that Olympus had paid an advisory fee of $687 million as part of the Gyrus acquisition. The typical advisory fee for a deal that size is between 1% and 2% of the purchase price. Olympus had paid 31%. 31%. To a company nobody had ever heard of, based in the Cayman Islands, that would be deleted from the company registry just months after receiving the money. Woodford walked into a lunch meeting with Chairman Kikukawa and the compliance officer, Hisashi Mori, and asked them about the article. Kikukawa told him the article was tabloid, sensationalist journalism. He also admitted, casually, that he had ordered staff not to tell Woodford about the allegations. Why? Because Woodford was too busy with other matters. And then a second FACTA article appeared. This one didn't just allege strange acquisitions. It alleged that Olympus had made payments to antisocial forces. In Japan, antisocial forces is the polite, deliberate term used in business and government to mean one thing: Yakuza, the Japanese mafia. To understand what Woodford had stumbled into, you need to go back to the late 1980s. Japan's economy was in the middle of a historic asset bubble. The stock market was booming. Property prices in Tokyo had risen so high that the land under the Imperial Palace was worth more than the entire state of California. Like many Japanese corporations of the era, Olympus didn't just sell cameras. It also gambled heavily on financial derivatives and currency trades, a practice the Japanese called Zai-tech financial engineering. Easy money. Then, in 1991, the bubble burst. Olympus had bet enormous sums of money on the markets. When the markets collapsed, those bets turned into massive losses. Not millions, hundreds of millions. Eventually, more than $1 billion. In any normal country, the company would have written down those losses, explained them to shareholders, and moved on. But Japan in the 1990s was not a normal country. Admitting a financial mistake of that scale was, for many executives, a fate worse than financial ruin. It was a loss of face. So Olympus did something else, something illegal. They invented a way to hide the losses on the balance sheet by passing them between shell companies in offshore jurisdictions. The Japanese called it tobashi, which translates loosely as to make fly away. The losses didn't disappear. They were just moved, shifted into offshore vehicles in the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, hidden behind a chain of nominee directors and front companies that became progressively harder to trace. For nearly 20 years, no auditor caught it. KPMG audited the books. They signed off. Then, in 2009, Ernst & Young took over. They signed off too. The losses just kept flying away. And this is where Michael Woodford comes in. Because in August and September of 2011, the new president did something nobody at the top of a Japanese corporation had ever really done before. He started writing letters. 6 letters, in total, to Chairman Kikukawa and Vice President Mori, demanding answers about the gyrus fee and the 3 mysterious Japanese acquisitions. He copied his lawyers. He copied the auditors. He copied Ernst & Young's global chairman. He hired PricewaterhouseCoopers to conduct an independent investigation. PwC confirmed his worst fears. The $687 million fee had been paid to 2 firms, Axis America in the U.S. and Axum Investments in the Cayman Islands. Axum had been struck from the registry just 3 months after its final payment. The money had been paid. The recipient had vanished. And on the 30th of September, 2011, while Woodford was still demanding answers, the Olympus board did something inexplicable. They promoted him from president to chief executive officer. The full power of the company in the hands of the one man who was asking the wrong questions. It made no sense, unless you understood what it was actually meant to do. There were 2 theories about why the board promoted Woodford to CEO. The first was that they genuinely believed in him. The second was darker. Several Japanese newspapers reported the promotion was a calculated move to bind him to the company, make him loyal, make him grateful, make him stop asking questions. If that was the strategy, it failed. The day after he became CEO, Woodford sent his final letter. He attached the PwC report. He warned of potential criminal liability. And he demanded that Kikukawa and Mori, the very men who had appointed him, resign. 6 days later, on the 14th of October, 2011, Kikukawa called an emergency board meeting. The agenda had been about ordinary business. When Kikukawa arrived, deliberately late, he set that agenda aside and asked the board to consider one motion: the dismissal of Michael Woodford as Chief Executive Officer. Woodford was not allowed to speak. He was not allowed to vote. The motion was carried unanimously by every other member of the board. He had been Chief Executive Officer for exactly 14 days. The official explanation, in a press release that went out within hours, was that Woodford had ignored established decision-making processes and created wedges within the company. Woodford left the building in a taxi. He went to his hotel. He packed a suitcase. And then he did something nobody had expected. He went straight to the airport. He flew to London. From the airplane, he made phone calls to his lawyers, to journalists at the Financial Times, to Reuters. By the time he landed at Heathrow, the story had already broken. The next morning, Olympus shares crashed. By the end of the trading day, the company had lost roughly $3.5 billion in market value. Within 4 weeks, the stock would lose 75% of its value. Woodford did not stop. He requested police protection from the British Serious Fraud Office. He flew to New York and gave a file of documents to the FBI. He went on Bloomberg television and said about the men who had fired him, "The board has to go. They're all toxic. They are all contaminated." And then the death threats started. Woodford described being followed. He moved his family. He hired security. Japanese newspapers speculated about Yakuza connections. And one major paper, Sankei Shimbun, suggested some of the brokers had ties to Japan's largest crime syndicate, the Yamaguchi-gumi. Olympus, of course, denied everything. The chairman gave a press conference on the 27th of October and blamed Woodford for the entire collapse, saying that if Woodford hadn't leaked secret information, there would have been no scandal. It would take exactly 2 more weeks for that defense to fall apart completely. On the 8th of November, 2011, exactly 25 days after firing Woodford, the new Olympus president stood before a room full of journalists in Tokyo, bowed deeply, and admitted that everything Woodford had alleged was true. The company confessed that money had been used to cover up losses dating back to the 1990s, that the advisory fees and the inflated acquisition prices were not legitimate expenses. They were part of a scheme to hide losses worth, by the company's initial admission, 117 billion yen, about $1.5 billion US. But that was just the first number. As investigators from the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, the Securities and Exchange Surveillance Commission, the British Serious Fraud Office, and the FBI started untangling the offshore web, the real magnitude became clear. According to an internal investigator's memorandum reported by the New York Times, the true magnitude of losses being concealed was approximately 481 billion yen, about $6.25 billion at the time. Of that, only a tiny fraction could be accounted for through legitimate business. The rest had been moved through at least 17 special-purpose vehicles in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. Investigators identified one of the acquired companies, Tsubasa Net, as a front with documented affiliations to the Yamaguchi-gumi. Altis, Humalabo, and News Chef were also identified as front companies with links to organized crime. By the end of November 2011, Chairman Kikukawa had resigned. So had Mori. So had the auditor, Hideo Yamada. Within months, the entire board would be gone. In February of 2012, Japanese police arrested 7 people: Kikukawa, Mori, Yamada, the 2 bankers behind the Cayman Shell Company, Akio Nakagawa and Nobumasa Yoku, and 2 others. In July of 2013, the Tokyo District Court handed down its sentences. Kikukawa, Mori, and Yamada each received 3 years in prison, though all 3 sentences were suspended. Olympus itself was fined 700 million yen, about $7 million. For one of the largest accounting frauds in Japanese history, only 2 people would actually serve prison time. The shareholders, however, were not finished. In 2019, a derivative lawsuit against the 3 executives ended in a judgment of 59.4 billion yen, about $594 million, the largest shareholder lawsuit ruling in Japanese history. And Michael Woodford? In May of 2012, he settled his lawsuit against Olympus for £10 million, about 16 million US dollars. He moved on to corporate governance consulting, gave millions to charity, and wrote a book about the experience called Exposures, now reportedly being adapted into a feature film. Olympus survived. The company laid off 2,700 employees, 7% of its workforce, and closed roughly 40% of its 30 manufacturing plants. But it survived. Today, it remains the dominant manufacturer of medical endoscopes in the world. And the term tobashi, to make fly away, became, briefly, one of the most searched Japanese words in the financial press. For 30 years, Michael Woodford climbed inside one of Japan's most opaque corporate cultures. He never spoke the language. He was never going to be one of them. And yet, somehow, in the spring of 2011, they handed him the keys. What he did with those keys is the real reason we tell this story. Because the easy thing, the rational thing, the safe thing would have been to leave, to take the title, collect the salary, smile for the cameras, and let the men who built the cover-up keep running it for another decade. He didn't. He wrote 6 letters. He hired auditors. He boarded a flight to London. He gave the documents to the police. And he stood in front of a Bloomberg camera and said, in the calmest possible voice, that the board of one of Japan's most respected companies was. And again, this is his exact word, contaminated. But here's what he kept. The thing nobody can take from him. The thing every CEO who stood quietly through a cover-up will never have. He told the truth, and the company he loved. The company that built him, promoted him, fired him, and tried to bury him, is still standing today, partly because he refused to let it lie. That's the story of Michael Woodford, the man who spent 30 years climbing to find one number and changed Japanese corporate governance forever. If you enjoyed this story, the next one is already on screen.